The fertility clinic smelled like antiseptic and quiet desperation, and Meredith had always hated both. She sat in the waiting room with her coat still buttoned, her hands folded in her lap the way her mother had taught her to sit in church. Still, composed, giving nothing away. The woman across from her was leafing through a parenting magazine, with the hollow eyes of someone who had already been through this more than once. Meredith looked away. She didn't want to make eye contact. She didn't want to share a knowing look with a stranger and have to hold that weight on top of everything else she was already carrying. She was 34 years old. She ran a small cafe on the corner of Elgin and Somerset in Ottawa, the kind of place with mismatched mugs and a chalkboard menu and a back table where regulars spent whole Saturday mornings with their laptops and their flat whites. She had a lease she could manage, a part-time employee she trusted, a cat named Biscuit who slept on the register. Her life was tidy and quiet and entirely her own. What it didn't have was a father for the child she was already imagining. Not because she hadn't tried. She had. There had been a man named Patrick who cried at every movie, which she'd found endearing until she realized it extended to commercials. There had been someone she met at a wine tasting who texted beautifully and showed up reliably and turned out to already have a girlfriend in Montreal. There had been 4 years with Daniel, kind, distracted Daniel, who loved her in the way people love a favorite sweater, comfortably, without particularly noticing it, until the day she asked where they were going, and he looked at her with something close to confusion and said he'd assumed they were already there. She had left. She had grieved. And then she had made a decision. She was doing this, on her own terms, with a donor she had carefully, painstakingly selected from a profile that included health history, education, a short essay about what family meant to him, and a voice recording she'd listened to 6 times in her car before finally clicking the button that said select. The donor profile listed him as Donor 7741. The essay said he believed in loyalty above almost everything else. The voice recording had been quiet, measured, unhurried. The voice of a man who had learned to take up exactly as much space as he needed and not an inch more. She had cried in her car afterward, which she hadn't expected. She told herself it didn't mean anything. 9 months and 11 days later, she gave birth to a daughter at the Ottawa General, surrounded by her best friend Cass, her mother on speakerphone from Edmonton, and a midwife named Ruth, who had the steady, gentle authority of someone who had caught 10,000 babies and intended to catch 10,000 more. She named her daughter Elodie. Elodie with the brown curls and the serious eyes and the little frown she made when she was thinking, which, as it turned out, was most of the time. She was 2.5 when Meredith first noticed it, the way she'd pause before answering even the simplest question. "What do you want for breakfast, Bug?" And Elodie would look at the ceiling, genuinely weighing her options, as though the choice between oatmeal and eggs had consequences. Meredith adored her, completely, helplessly, in the way that scares you when you first feel it. She adored the cafe too, and the regulars, and the particular weight of Saturday mornings when the whole city seemed to exhale at once. But there were also days, usually Tuesday nights, after Elodie was asleep and the dishwasher was running and the apartment was very quiet, when Meredith sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold and thought about Donor 7741 and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not longing exactly. More like an incomplete sentence, a door she'd closed but never locked. She didn't think about him the way a person thinks about someone they know. She thought about him the way you think about a stranger you passed once on a train, someone whose face you caught for just a moment before the platform disappeared. An impression, not a memory. She was not prepared in any way for the morning he walked into her cafe. It was a Thursday in October, which is the most ordinary kind of morning Ottawa produces. The leaves were doing their annual performance, amber and rust along the canal, tourists still lingering to photograph them. Meredith had been at the cafe since 6, same as always. She'd started the first brew, fixed the sticky latch on the pastry case, and was chalking the day's specials onto the board when the door opened and brought in a gust of cold air and a man she had never seen before. Tall, dark coat, the particular stillness of someone who is always the most dangerous person in the room, and has learned to make it look like calm. She noticed him the way you notice a change in weather, not consciously, just a shift in the air. He went to the counter and ordered a black coffee without looking at the menu, paid in cash, took the corner table that no one ever wanted because the Wi-Fi didn't reach and the light was bad. He came back the next Thursday, and the Thursday after that. By the fourth Thursday, Meredith knew his order, which was the first thing she learned about most regulars. By the sixth, she knew he always arrived between 8:15 and 8:30 and was gone within the hour. By the eighth, she had learned his name, not from him, but from a man who came in with him once, a younger man in a good suit who said, "Nikolaj, they don't have oat milk," with the tone of someone delivering news he expected to be unpleasant. Nikolaj. She turned it over in her mind afterward, which she recognized was not entirely rational. He wasn't the kind of man who was easy to talk to. He wasn't unfriendly. Exactly. When she refilled his coffee, he said thank you with complete sincerity. And when she mentioned one Thursday that they'd started carrying a new Kenyan roast, he listened with the focused attention of someone for whom this information genuinely mattered. But there was a boundary around him that she felt without being able to articulate it, the way you feel a fence line in the dark. She told Cass about him that November, in the way that you tell your best friend about something you're trying to keep small. "There's a regular," she said carefully. "Interesting." Cass looked at her over her wine glass. Interesting like the guy who turned out to be a conspiracy theorist, or interesting like actually interesting? "The second one. I think, does he have a name?" "Nikolaj, it's a name with a past," Cass said, which wasn't helpful, but also wasn't wrong. The conversation that changed everything happened on a morning in late November, after the first real snow. The café was quieter than usual. The storm had thinned the foot traffic, and Nikolaj arrived at his regular time and ordered his regular coffee and sat at his corner table. After an hour, he was still there. Meredith brought him a second coffee without being asked. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know." She hesitated. She was not usually a woman who hesitated. "It's slow this morning. I made too much." He looked at her, really looked for the first time she could remember, and said, "You run this place alone? I have help on weekends. But mostly, yes. How long?" 6 years. Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly. More like recalibration. "That's not easy." "No," she agreed. "But neither is most things worth doing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You have a daughter." She stilled. "How do you know that?" "There's a drawing on the edge of your chalkboard, in the corner. A cat with 5 legs." He paused. "The proportions suggest a child under 4. She looked at the board. There was, in fact, a 5-legged cat in the bottom corner. That she'd been leaving there for 3 weeks because Elodie had drawn it during a slow afternoon, and Meredith couldn't bring herself to wipe it away. "She's 3, Meredith said, and something in her voice did something she didn't intend. He heard it. She could tell, because he looked away, which was the kind of courtesy that costs something. "She's lucky," he said, "to have someone like you." Meredith didn't know what to say to that, so she went back behind the counter and stood there for a while, pretending to reorganize the cups. She didn't intend to see him outside the café. That wasn't a decision she made. It was just the way things were structured, the tidy boundaries she'd built around the different parts of her life. The café was the café. Home was home. Elodie's daycare was exactly 8 minutes from the café on foot, and she timed it perfectly on good days and sprinted it on bad ones. The evening she ran into him at the canal, it had been a bad day. Not dramatically bad, just the accumulating weight of a broken espresso machine, a missed phone call from her accountant, and a child who'd spent the entire walk home asking why the sky got dark earlier now, with an urgency that implied this was happening to them specifically. "I don't know, Bug," Meredith had said, honestly. "It just does. Every year. But why us? It happens to everyone." Elodie had considered this with her customary gravity. Even the ducks? Even the ducks. They were walking along the canal path when she saw him. Nikolaj, sitting on a bench with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the water with the particular expression of a man who comes to the same place regularly and doesn't feel the need to explain why. He saw her at the same moment. There was a fraction of a second where both of them had the option to nod and keep moving, Neither of them took it. Meredith, he said. Nikolaj. She pulled Elodie a little closer out of reflex, the reflex every single mother develops and doesn't apologize for. This is Elodie. Elodie looked at him with her serious, ceiling consulting eyes. You have a very long coat, she said. I do, he agreed, entirely without condescension. Is it warm? Extremely. Elodie nodded, apparently satisfied that this was the right answer. She turned to Meredith. Can we feed the ducks now? We don't have any bread, Bug. We could go get bread. Meredith looked at Nikolaj. He was watching Elodie with an expression she couldn't read. Something careful in it. Something that looked for just a moment like recognition. I know a place, he said, that sells good bread nearby. If you wanted. She should have said no. The sensible, boundaried version of herself, who had read the situation clearly for 6 years, should have smiled and said they needed to get home before dark. She said, okay. They walked to the little Ukrainian bakery on Daly that Meredith had passed 100 times and never gone into. Nikolaj bought a small loaf without consulting the menu, same as he ordered his coffee. Elodie held the bag with both hands on the walk back to the water, as though it was something precious. They stood at the edge of the canal and threw bread in pieces, and Elodie narrated the duck's behavior in a running commentary that required no input from either adult. Meredith stood beside Nikolaj and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely comfortable standing next to someone she didn't fully know. You come here often, she said. It wasn't a question. I grew up near water, he said. I still need it close. Where? He was quiet for a moment. Eastern Europe. A long time ago. She didn't press. She had learned to read the shape of what people didn't say. Running a cafe for 6 years taught you that quickly. There were the silences that invited follow-up questions and the silences that were, themselves, the answer. His was the second kind. I've been in Ottawa 12 years, he said, which seemed to be what he was offering instead. You don't seem like Ottawa, she said, without meaning to say it out loud. He turned to look at her. What do I seem like? She couldn't answer that, honestly, so she looked at Elodie instead, who had run out of bread and was now crouching down to address a duck personally. A man with a complicated life, she said finally, who chose somewhere quiet. The silence that followed was the longest he'd ever given her. When she glanced at him, something had shifted in his face, not closed down, but opened slightly, the way a window opens when you stop expecting it to. Yes, he said. Something like that. She didn't tell Cass about the canal, not right away. She needed to sit with it first, hold it in a quieter part of herself, the part that didn't have commentary yet. What she knew was this. She was not a woman who imagined things. She was grounded and practical and capable of separating a feeling from a fact. What she felt, walking home that evening with Elodie's small hand in hers and the sound of the canal fading behind them, was not a feeling she could afford to name. He came into the café the next Thursday, and the Thursday after. They talked more now, small things, accumulated carefully, the way you build something in a space that won't hold anything too heavy too fast. She learned that he drank his coffee black because he'd spent years in places where milk wasn't reliable. That he had a younger sister somewhere in Europe he still called every Sunday. That he'd never learned to drive because where he was from, you walked, and Ottawa was one of the few places left where walking still made sense. She did not learn what he did for a living, and she did not ask. This was the thing she told herself later, that she hadn't asked, which meant she had chosen not to know. And there is a kind of willful ignorance that isn't really ignorance at all. It was Cass who found out. Cass, who worked in financial compliance and spent her professional life pulling threads, who had looked at Meredith across a dinner table one February evening and said, "Tell me his last name. I don't know his last name. You've been talking to this man for 4 months, at a cafe. It's not a legal deposition. What's his first name again?" Nikolaj. Cass had looked at her phone, looked back up. Nikolaj? What? I don't? Tall? Dark coat? Corner table at your place on Elgin? Meredith set down her fork. How do you know that? Because I've seen him there. Cass's voice had changed, something careful in it now, something that Meredith recognized as the tone Cass used when she had information she wasn't sure how to deliver. Meredith, what do you know about him? He grew up in Eastern Europe. He has a sister. He likes Kenyan roast. What does he do? I don't know. Cass put her phone face down on the table. This was, in their friendship's private language, a significant gesture. Cass, you need to look him up. Look him up how? I don't have a last name. You don't need one. There's a photograph. Someone took one outside your café last month, one of those neighborhood blog things, Ottawa street scenes. He's in the background. She paused. I reverse image searched it. You did what? His name is Nikolaj Vanek. Another pause. Meredith. He runs half the import logistics on the east side of this city. And not the kind of logistics that files clean quarterly reports. The kitchen was very quiet. What are you saying? I'm saying that the people who know his name in this city either owe him something or are afraid of him. Sometimes both. Cass reached across the table and covered Meredith's hand with hers. I'm saying be careful. She was not careful, which was perhaps the most honest thing she could say about herself in that period. She went home that night and sat at the kitchen table with her tea and thought about Donner 7741, about the essay that said loyalty above almost everything else, about the voice recording, measured, unhurried, and the way she had sat in her car and cried for reasons she still couldn't fully explain. She thought about Elodie's serious eyes, about the five-legged cat on the chalkboard, about a man who had noticed that a child had drawn it and who had looked at the water in the canal with the expression of someone who had come from somewhere hard and was choosing, every day, to be somewhere quieter. She thought, there are things I don't know how to know. She thought, there are things I'm going to have to know anyway. She found the registration number in a database she didn't have direct access to, but Cass did. It took 3 days, an uncomfortable favor, and a long conversation she'd rather not revisit. What it confirmed was worse and better than she'd imagined simultaneously. Worse because it was real and documented in ways that couldn't be denied. Better because the more recent records showed a man who operated in the gray space between what couldn't be proven and what no one had tried hard enough to prove. She sat with this for 2 weeks. Then she went to the café on a Thursday morning, opened at 6 as always, made the first brew, fixed the latch on the pastry case, and waited. He came at 8:20. She let him order his coffee. She let him take his corner table. She waited until the morning rush had thinned and the 2 other tables had cleared. Then she poured herself a coffee she didn't want, walked over to the corner, and sat down across from him without being invited. He looked at her. He did not look surprised. There are things I need to tell you, she said, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything. A pause then. All right, 3.5 years ago, I used a sperm donor to conceive my daughter. She kept her voice even, the way she'd rehearsed it. The clinic was anonymous. I was given a number, not a name. Donor 7741. She watched his face. I had the profile, the health history, an essay about what family meant, a voice recording. She stopped. I recognized your voice, Nikolaj. Not immediately, not consciously, but over months it came through, the way you pace a sentence, the way you pause before certain words. I didn't want it to be true, so I took a long time to know it. And then I found out other things about you, and I took even longer. She set a folder on the table between them. It contained almost nothing, 3 pages, the DNA summary she'd had run quietly through a private lab 2 months after she'd started suspecting, which she had paid for in cash and told no one about. Not Cass, not anyone. Elodie is your biological daughter, she said. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not threatening you. I'm not going to the media or anyone else. I needed you to know because. She stopped, restarted. Because she deserves to exist in a world where the truth is known to someone who ought to know it, even if nothing changes. Silence. Outside, the October rain had started again. A streetcar went by on Elgin. A regular came through the door, saw Meredith's expression, quietly turned, and left. Nikolaj looked at the folder. He didn't open it. I know, he said. She stared at him. I'm sorry? I know who she is. He said it quietly, with the same unhurried cadence she had recognized in a car 6 years ago. I've known for some time. The blood left her face. How? When I first came into this cafe, it wasn't by accident. He held her gaze and didn't flinch from it. A friend of mine works in records management, not within the clinic, adjacent to it. I had an anomaly flagged some years ago regarding my donor profile. I found out there had been a use. One. He paused. I spent 4 months deciding what to do with that. And then I speak for a moment. You've been coming here for a year, she finally said. Yes, Noix? Yes, and you said nothing. I didn't know how to say it. I didn't know what I had the right to say. He looked down at the folder, then back up at her. I came in and I ordered a coffee. I watched you run this place. I watched you with her. On the afternoons she's here. I thought. Something moved across his face that she had never seen before. I thought if I was going to be in her life in any capacity, you needed to trust me first. That was more important than the information. Meredith stared at him. She had spent 3 months preparing for this conversation. She had prepared for denial and for anger, and for the particular kind of cold charm that men like him were reportedly capable of deploying. She had not prepared for this. For a man who had spent 12 months earning something he thought he had no right to simply take. Who are you? She asked, not rhetorically, genuinely. Complicated, he said. I've been trying to become less so. Are you dangerous? He considered this for longer than she expected. Less than I was. More than you'd probably like. That's not an answer. It's an honest one. She looked at him across the corner table that no one wanted because the Wi-Fi didn't reach and the light was bad. She thought about Elodie crouching down to address a duck personally. She thought about bread in a paper bag and Kenyan roast and a 5-legged cat on a chalkboard that she'd never wiped away. I need time, she said. Yes, he said. Take it. She took 4 months. During those 4 months, Nikolaj continued coming to the café on Thursdays, and she continued making his coffee, and they talked, not about the thing between them, but around it, the same careful accumulation of small truths that had been building since October a year ago. She learned the name of his sister, Katarzyna, who lived in Prague and called him every Sunday and was apparently, according to Nikolaj, aggressively normal in a way he found both baffling and comforting. She learned that he had not eaten a proper meal in his own kitchen until he was 29 years old, because before that there had always been someone else providing it, and the reasons for that were complicated. She learned that he had 5 years ago begun the process of what he described only as restructuring. She didn't press for details, but what she understood was that it was real and documented and that it had cost him significantly. She also, over those 4 months, told Elodie that there was a man she was getting to know, not more than that. Elodie had considered this information with her usual gravity. Is he nice? She asked. I think so, Meredith said carefully. I'm still figuring it out. Elodie nodded. The ducks at the canal took a long time to like me too, she said. But then they did. Meredith sat with that for a long time. The first time Nikolaj met Elodie again, properly, not the accidental canal encounter. It was a Saturday in March, still cold, the canal frozen solid. He brought the bread again. This time unnecessarily, since they could not feed the ducks. Elodie stood at the edge of the ice and looked at him. Why did you bring bread if there are no ducks? Habit, he said. That's not a good reason. No, he agreed. You're right. Elodie looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, you can carry the bread if you want, and handed it back to him, which was, Meredith understood, the highest honor available. They walked along the canal in the pale March light, the three of them, and Nikolaj carried the bread with both hands, and Elodie told him at length about a dream she'd had, involving a purple horse who could also bake, and he listened with the complete attention of someone for whom this story mattered very much. Meredith walked beside him and felt the incomplete sentence in her finally reaching for its last word. She didn't say it yet. She was still figuring out the courage. But that evening, after Elodie was asleep and the dishwasher was running and the apartment was quiet, in the way it always was. On Tuesday nights, she sat at the kitchen table with her tea. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, it didn't feel like something missing. It felt like the beginning of something she hadn't planned for, hadn't expected, and might, if she was careful and honest and patient with herself, be brave enough to choose.